Hello and welcome. Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing, long-form history videos like this, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you are listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing people from all over the world tuning in at different hours of the day and night. Let's begin. When we think of the American Civil War, images often come to mind of gallant charges across open fields, heroic speeches, and the sweeping tides of history that shaped a nation. But for the ordinary soldier, the young man who shouldered a musket, slung a bedroll across his back, and marched off to war, the reality was far less romantic. The day-to-day existence of a Civil War soldier was defined not by glory, but by discomfort, danger, disease, and deprivation. The war began in April of 1861, and by the time it ended 4 years later, over 3 million men had served in Union or Confederate forces. Many were volunteers, swept up in patriotic fervor, community pressure, or the hope of adventure. Others were drafted, compelled to fight whether they wanted to or not. Some were as young as 12 or 13, drummer boys and messengers, while others were seasoned veterans of previous wars, or men in their 40s who left behind families and farms. No matter how they came into the army, almost none of them could have imagined the reality that awaited them. Their days were not spent in constant combat. In fact, most soldiers saw relatively few actual battles. Instead, their lives were dominated by long stretches of boredom, broken by moments of pure terror when fighting erupted. In between were endless marches, cramped and filthy camp life, bad food, and the ever-present spectre of disease. Enlistment and illusions. When the first wave of soldiers signed up in 1861, many were under the impression that the war would be short. Politicians and newspapers predicted it would be over in just a few months. Young men joked that they'd be home by Christmas. This belief led many to enlist with enthusiasm, often encouraged by local rallies where bands played, flags waved, and community leaders promised honor and adventure. Uniforms were often brand new, and in the early days of the war, they could be quite colorful. Some Union regiments wore bright blue trousers and tall hats. Some Confederate units entered the field in homespun gray that varied in shade from light to almost brown. Early photographs from 1861 show smiling young men posing with rifles, their faces full of optimism. But optimism fades quickly when faced with reality. Once the initial excitement wore off, soldiers realized that army life was not the grand adventure they had imagined. In many ways, their hardships began almost immediately. Camp life, the illusion of rest. Most soldiers spent far more time in camp than in battle, but this did not mean they were comfortable. Camps were usually hastily established in open fields, forests, or along riverbanks. Tents were small. The standard Union A tent, for example, was a simple canvas structure that could hold 2 to 4 men at most. In bad weather, the canvas leaked, and in summer, it trapped heat. Confederate soldiers often had even worse accommodations, relying on crude shelters made of whatever they could find: branches, blankets, or scraps of cloth. In these close quarters, privacy was non-existent. You might share your sleeping space with men who snored loudly, smoked constantly, or had poor hygiene. Vermin, especially lice and fleas, were a constant nuisance. Clothing went unwashed for long stretches, and blankets were rarely cleaned. The camp latrines were primitive, often just shallow pits dug into the ground. If these were not placed far enough from the tents or the water supply, disease could spread rapidly. And disease was the true killer of the Civil War. More soldiers died from illness than from bullets or bayonets. The daily routine. A soldier's day typically began at dawn with the bugle or drum signaling reveille. This was followed by roll call and morning drill. Even in winter or during rain, drills continued, often for hours at a time. Commanders believed in constant drilling to instill discipline, keep soldiers occupied, and prepare them for the chaos of battle. Meals were taken in company mess groups, and the food was often uninspiring. Union soldiers might receive hardtack, a dense, rock-hard cracker made of flour, water, and salt, along with salted pork or beef, beans, and sometimes coffee. Confederate rations were usually smaller and less varied, especially as the war dragged on and supply lines became strained. Soldiers learned to get creative, frying hardtack in bacon grease or crumbling it into coffee to make it more palatable. Still, weevils, mold, and general staleness were common. When not drilling or on guard duty, soldiers might be assigned to work parties, chopping wood, digging latrines, building fortifications, or fetching water. Free time was rare, but when it came, soldiers would write letters home, play cards, whittle, or sing songs to pass the hours. Marching, the true test. While camp life was uncomfortable, the real physical test came during marches. Civil War armies moved primarily on foot, covering anywhere from 10 to 20 miles a day, sometimes more in emergencies. Each soldier carried a musket or rifle weighing around 9 pounds, ammunition, a haversack with food, a canteen, a bedroll or blanket, and sometimes extra clothing or personal items. Altogether, the load could weigh 40 to 50 pounds or more. Roads in the 1860s were often little more than dirt tracks, turning to deep mud after rain. Soldiers might march for hours through choking dust or ankle-deep muck, their feet blistered and swollen. Shoes wore out quickly, and replacements were not always available. Confederate soldiers in particular were sometimes reduced to walking barefoot, even in winter. Marching in hot weather brought its own dangers. Heat exhaustion and dehydration could strike suddenly, especially for men unaccustomed to such exertion. In cold weather, frostbite was a constant threat. Some soldiers recalled their hands and feet going numb on winter marches, only to regain feeling in the most painful way when they reached camp. If one thing terrified Civil War soldiers more than enemy gunfire, it was disease. In fact, sickness was far more likely to end a soldier's life than any bullet. For every soldier killed in combat, roughly 2 died from disease. This wasn't because the men were weak or unwilling to fight. It was because 19th century armies were breeding grounds for illness. Thousands of men lived in cramped camps with poor sanitation, drinking from the same water sources they used to bathe in, surrounded by garbage and latrines that often overflowed after rainstorms. The most common killers, the most feared and deadly diseases were not exotic tropical plagues, but common infections we now consider preventable or treatable. Dysentery, typhoid fever, measles, smallpox, pneumonia, and malaria all ran rampant in both Union and Confederate camps. Dysentery, sometimes called the flux, was the single biggest killer. Caused by contaminated food or water, it led to severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness. Once it set in, there was little that could be done except to hope the patient survived. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated drinking water, producing high fevers, rashes, and delirium. Without antibiotics, the mortality rate was high. Measles might seem like a childhood illness today, but for young men in the 1860s who had never been exposed before, it could be deadly, especially when combined with pneumonia. Malaria was particularly common in the South, where swamps and warm climates provided ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Quinine, the only known treatment, was in short supply for much of the war, especially in Confederate territory. Why disease spread so easily? Sanitary practices were primitive. Many soldiers had never learned the connection between waste, water, and illness. Latrines were sometimes dug just a few yards from camp kitchens. Hand washing was rare. Garbage and food scraps attracted flies, which then spread contamination. When a man fell ill, he might still share a tent with his healthy comrades, passing on his sickness. Isolation was rare, and hospitals, when they existed, were often overcrowded. One Union soldier recalled arriving at a field hospital and finding the stench so strong it was difficult to breathe. Patients lay on straw pallets, soaked with sweat and blood. Flies covered their faces, and groans of pain filled the air. The harsh reality of Civil War medicine. If you were wounded or became seriously ill, your best hope was to be treated by the regimental surgeon or assistant surgeon. Unfortunately, medical knowledge in the 1860s was limited. Germ theory, the idea that disease was caused by microscopic organisms, was still relatively unknown in America. Surgeons often operated with unwashed hands and reused instruments without sterilizing them. Amputations were the most common surgical procedure, and they were often performed quickly, sometimes in less than 10 minutes, without anesthetic early in the war. Chloroform and ether became more common later, but supplies were inconsistent. While these amputations saved lives by preventing infection from spreading, They left many survivors disabled. Artificial limbs were crude, and veterans often struggled with lifelong pain. The psychological toll. Beyond the physical suffering, the constant presence of sickness and death took a heavy psychological toll. Soldiers might watch a tentmate grow weaker each day until he passed, then see his body buried in a shallow grave nearby. Some regiments lost more men to illness in a few months than they did in an entire year of combat. Letters home were often filled with somber updates. Our boys are falling every day, not from bullets, but from fever, one soldier wrote to his family in 1862. Another wrote, "We fight the rebels in the field, but we fight disease in camp, and disease is the worst enemy." For many soldiers, the war became less about the clash of armies and more about surviving the slow, grinding threat of illness. While disease was the leading killer in the Civil War, battle remained the most terrifying and unforgettable part of a soldier's experience. The actual moments of combat were rare compared to the long stretches of marching and camp life. But when they came, they brought chaos, noise, fear, and destruction, unlike anything most young men had ever imagined. Many soldiers entered their first battle with romantic notions shaped by parades, patriotic speeches, and perhaps even stories from veterans of the Mexican-American War. They imagined lines of soldiers firing in unison, gallant charges, and a quick, decisive outcome. The truth was far more brutal. The soundscape of battle. A Civil War battlefield was deafening. Muskets cracked in rapid succession, their black powder producing thick clouds of smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. The roar of artillery, cannons firing solid shot, explosive shells, or canister rounds, added deep, thudding booms that could be felt in the chest as much as heard. Bugles and drums tried to cut through the chaos, signaling orders, but many soldiers recalled being unable to hear anything except the steady, overwhelming noise of combat, shouts from officers, the screams of the wounded, and the neighing of frightened horses filled the air. One Union veteran described it years later. It was like being inside a thunderstorm, only the thunder was constant and the rain was lead. Visibility and confusion. Unlike the clear battle scenes shown in modern movies, real Civil War combat was often fought in near blindness once the shooting began. Black powder muskets created huge amounts of smoke, which quickly settled over the field. Visibility could drop to a few yards, and soldiers sometimes fired blindly toward the sound of the enemy. In such conditions, confusion was inevitable. Orders might be misunderstood or never received. Units became separated. Men could find themselves suddenly alone, surrounded by strangers or enemy troops. Friendly fire, accidentally shooting one's own comrades, was tragically common. The weapons and their effects. The primary weapon of the Civil War infantryman was the rifled musket, usually a .58 caliber Springfield, or 5.77 caliber Enfield. These fired a soft lead projectile called a minié ball, which was conical and designed to expand on firing, gripping the rifling in the barrel for improved accuracy. The minié ball travelled more slowly than modern bullets, but its mass and design caused devastating wounds. It could shatter bone, tear through muscle, and leave ragged exit wounds. Amputation was often the only medical option for limb injuries. Artillery added another level of destruction. Solid shot could crush men in its path, while exploding shells sent shards of metal flying in all directions. Canister shot, essentially a giant shotgun blast of iron balls, was particularly deadly at close range, mowing down ranks of soldiers in seconds. Cavalry charges, though less common in the later war, could still be terrifying. Mounted troops wielding sabers or pistols could smash into infantry units that failed to form proper defensive lines. The pace of battles rarely unfolded in one swift motion. They were often long, grinding affairs, lasting many hours or even several days. A soldier might spend part of the day in fierce fighting, then endure hours of waiting in a muddy trench or behind a fence line, listening to distant gunfire and wondering when, or if, he would be called forward again. At times, soldiers would be ordered to charge across open ground toward enemy positions. These were some of the deadliest moments, as defenders firing from cover could cut down attackers before they got within musket range. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg is the most famous example, but similar assaults happened at battlefields across the war. Fear and courage. The human reaction to combat varied widely. Some soldiers fought with remarkable steadiness, loading and firing calmly under fire. Others froze, unable to move or shoot. A few broke and ran, something that carried stigma, but was far more common than wartime propaganda admitted. The fear was not just of being killed. Soldiers dreaded being wounded and left in the no man's land between lines, unable to move, exposed to the elements, and at risk of being trampled or struck again. They feared the agony of surgery, the possibility of dying far from home, and the shame of being remembered as a coward. And yet, many pressed on. Peer pressure, loyalty to one's regiment, and the belief that running would endanger comrades kept men in the fight. In letters home, soldiers often downplayed their fear, but diaries and memoirs written later reveal that the memory of combat, the smell of powder, the screams, the sight of the wounded, stayed with them for life. After the smoke cleared, when a battle ended, the field was transformed into a scene of devastation. Bodies lay scattered, some still groaning, for water or help. Horses, too, lay dead or dying. Weapons, torn clothing, broken wagons, and abandoned gear littered the ground. For those who survived, the next task was often to care for the wounded, both friend and foe. Men used doors, fence rails, or blankets as improvised stretchers. Field hospitals overflowed within hours. The work was exhausting, grim and heartbreaking. The survivors then faced the grim duty of burying the dead. Graves might be shallow and unmarked, especially if the army had to move quickly. The knowledge that friends had been left behind weighed heavily on many soldiers. For those who lived through it, combat was rarely remembered as glorious. Instead, it was a maelstrom of noise, confusion, and horror, a defining reason why serving as a soldier in the Civil War was such a miserable, soul-testing experience. While much of Civil War combat involved firing from a distance, there were moments when the fighting became close and personal. Charges into enemy trenches or fortifications sometimes devolved into hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers swung muskets like clubs, used bayonets in brutal thrusts, and even resorted to fists or rocks when weapons broke or ammunition ran out. Bayonet wounds were relatively rare compared to bullet injuries, partly because closing with an armed enemy was risky, but when they occurred, they were often fatal due to infection. The psychological strain of facing an opponent within arm's reach, seeing his face, and knowing that only one of you would likely walk away, was something soldiers seldom forgot. One Confederate soldier at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse described the infamous Bloody Angle as a place where the dead lay stacked like cordwood, where the smoke was so thick you could hardly breathe, and where men fought like wild animals in a pen. The smell of battle. Veterans often wrote about the smell of the battlefield, a pungent mix of black powder smoke, churned earth, sweat, blood, and in the hours or days after a fight, the unmistakable odor of death. On hot days, the stench could become overwhelming, particularly when wounded men lay unattended between the lines. For many survivors, that smell could bring back vivid memories years later. Even decades on, reunions of veterans sometimes noted how the scent of fireworks or gun ranges would cause old soldiers to grow quiet. Psychological trauma. Before PTSD had a name. The Civil War occurred long before modern psychology recognized conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the symptoms were present all the same. Soldiers wrote of nightmares, sudden panic at loud noises, trouble sleeping, and feelings of detachment after returning home. The term soldier's heart was sometimes used in the 19th century to describe veterans who seemed nervous, irritable, or prone to heart palpitations and exhaustion. Conditions we now understand could be linked to both stress and physical strain. Many veterans carried invisible wounds long after the war ended. The luck factor. On the battlefield, survival often came down to luck as much as skill. Minié balls could kill outright, but just as often they glanced off bone or passed through without striking a vital organ. Men sometimes survived incredible wounds, while others died from seemingly minor injuries that became infected. Letters and diaries often reflect this awareness of luck. A Union soldier after Antietam wrote, "I do not know why I yet breathe when the man to my left fell dead, and the man to my right lost his arm." The silence. After battle. Perhaps the most jarring moment for many soldiers was the silence after the fighting stopped. After hours of deafening noise, the sudden quiet could feel surreal. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was heavy, broken only by the moans of the wounded, the cries for water, and the occasional gunshot as an injured horse was put down. Men wandered the battlefield searching for friends, often finding only their bodies. Chaplains and officers walked among the dead and dying, offering prayers or messages to carry home. Some soldiers admitted to breaking down in tears, unable to contain the emotions they had suppressed during the fight. For all its patriotic framing in newspapers and speeches, the reality of Civil War combat was far from glorious. It was unpredictable, filthy, deafening, terrifying, and traumatic, and it stayed with those who experienced it for the rest of their lives. If combat was the most terrifying part of a soldier's life, marching was the most exhausting. The armies of the Civil War moved primarily on foot, and for the men in the ranks, that meant day after day of carrying heavy gear over long distances, often in miserable conditions. The average day on the march, orders to move could come at any hour. Sometimes soldiers were roused at dawn and told to be ready within minutes. Other times a march would begin in the cool, dark hours before sunrise to avoid the worst heat of the day. Once the column began moving, it could stretch for miles. A river of blue or grey uniforms, muskets slung over shoulders, the steady rhythm of boots and brogans hitting dirt or mud. The pace varied. On good roads and in fair weather, an army might cover 15 to 20 miles in a day. In emergencies or forced marches, that distance could double. But for the men doing the walking, even 10 miles under load was enough to sap energy and morale. The burden on the back. Every soldier was expected to carry his own kit. This included his musket or rifle musket, about 9 pounds, cartridge box and ammunition, a bayonet, a haversack with rations, a canteen, a bedroll or blanket, possibly a shelter, half for those in the Union Army, extra clothing, and personal items like letters from home or a small Bible. Altogether, the load could easily weigh 40 to 50 pounds. On level ground, that was tiring. On steep hills, in deep mud, or under a blazing summer sun, it was punishing. Many soldiers learned to discard anything non-essential during long marches. Extra shirts, sentimental keepsakes, even heavy overcoats. The roadside, after a march, was often littered with abandoned gear. Roads that weren't roads. In the mid-19th century, much of America's road system was poorly developed, especially in rural areas where battles were often fought. In dry weather, dusty roads choked the lungs. In wet weather, they turned into deep ruts of sticky clay or ankle-deep mud. Bridges might be washed out or burned, forcing detours through swamps or rocky fords. River crossings were slow, especially if ferries or pontoon bridges had to be built. The constant pounding of thousands of boots and wagon wheels only made bad roads worse. Confederate soldiers, especially in the latter part of the war, often lacked proper shoes. marching barefoot on rough ground, left feet cut and bleeding. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in rags or bits of animal hide as makeshift footwear. The strain on the body. Blisters were the most common complaint. Ill-fitting shoes, long distances, and wet socks combined to create raw, open sores that could become infected. Foot injuries might sound minor, but for a marching soldier, they could be crippling. Shoulder and back pain were constant from carrying heavy muskets and packs. Dehydration was another hazard. Canteens might run dry hours before the next water source, especially in the heat of summer. Some men drank from streams or ponds without boiling the water, risking disease in exchange for relief from thirst. Weather, the unforgiving companion. Marches took place in all weather. In summer, men sweltered under wool. Uniforms, sweat soaking through their clothing. Sunstroke was a real danger, and soldiers sometimes collapsed in the road, unable to continue. In winter, marches became an endurance test against cold, wind, and snow. Breath froze on beards and scarves. Fingers went numb gripping rifle stocks. Confederate troops in particular suffered from a shortage of winter clothing, sometimes wrapping themselves in blankets while on the move just to cut the chill. Rain was its own misery. Once drenched, a soldier might have to march for hours in wet clothing, the damp seeping into boots and chilling the body. Mud stuck to everything, doubling the weight of boots and making every step a slog. Hunger on the road. Rations were issued as often as supply lines allowed, but on the march, shortages were common. Soldiers might start the day with a small breakfast, perhaps hardtack and coffee for Union troops, or cornmeal cakes for Confederates, and then have nothing else until they halted for the night. When supplies ran short, men resorted to foraging, seeking out farms or livestock along the way. Union soldiers moving through Confederate territory sometimes took food without payment, an act that bred resentment among Southern civilians. Confederate soldiers, marching through their own countryside, relied on the generosity of locals or whatever they could scavenge. The endless nature of it. Perhaps the most demoralizing part of marching was the sheer monotony. A soldier might tramp for miles with no clear idea of where he was headed or why. Orders could change mid-route. A march begun in one direction might end with the army circling back to its starting point. The joke in both armies was that the only thing certain about a march was that it would be longer than promised. One Confederate private quipped, "We have marched so much, I believe we are wearing a road clear through the country from Richmond to the Mississippi." And yet, marching was unavoidable. Armies could only fight when they were where the enemy was. And getting there meant mile after weary mile, day after day, with no guarantee of rest at the end. For a Civil War soldier, hunger was an almost constant companion. Armies marched and fought on their stomachs. But keeping thousands of men fed every day in the 1860s was a monumental challenge. Supply lines stretched for miles, moving on horse-drawn wagons over rough and unreliable roads. Bad weather, enemy raids, and sheer logistical limitations often meant that food simply did not arrive when it was supposed to. Even when rations did come, they were rarely fresh, sometimes unrecognizable, and often barely edible. Union soldiers were generally better supplied than their Confederate counterparts. A standard Union ration might include a piece of salted pork or beef, a portion of hardtack, beans or peas, sugar, coffee, and occasionally vinegar or dried fruit. It sounded adequate on paper, but in practice, the salted meat was often so heavily preserved it had to be boiled multiple times before it could be eaten without gagging. Hardtack, the infamous cracker of Civil War lore, was rock hard and could break a tooth if bitten directly. Many soldiers softened it by soaking it in coffee or frying it in bacon grease. Even so, it was prone to infestation. Weevils and other insects were so common that soldiers joked about extra protein in their meals. Coffee, when available, was prized not just for its taste, but for the energy and comfort it provided. Men brewed it over small campfires at every opportunity, the smell of it drifting through camps like a promise of home. Confederate soldiers faced far harsher conditions. As the war progressed and the Union blockade tightened, Southern supply lines collapsed. Cornmeal often replaced flour entirely, and fresh meat became a rarity. Many Confederate troops subsisted on kush, a simple mixture of cornmeal and water cooked into a thick porridge, or on sweet potatoes when they could be found. Salt was scarce, making it difficult to preserve meat, and without refrigeration, anything fresh had to be eaten immediately or risked spoiling in the heat. The lack of variety in the Southern diet led to widespread malnutrition, weakening soldiers before they even stepped onto the battlefield. Water, though abundant in rivers and streams, was rarely clean. Soldiers drank from whatever source was available, whether it was a clear running creek or a stagnant pond shared with livestock. Few understood the dangers of contaminated water, and even fewer took the time to boil it. As a result, waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever spread rapidly. Some units tried to dig wells in camp, but the close proximity of latrines often meant those wells were just as contaminated as surface water. The desperate need to quench thirst during long marches meant men frequently drank without thinking, swallowing more than just water. They were swallowing invisible killers. Food scarcity often forced soldiers into foraging or outright theft. Union troops in Confederate territory sometimes took livestock, grain, or vegetables from local farms, paying only when orders required it. Confederate soldiers, marching through their own homeland, often relied on the generosity of civilians who were themselves struggling to feed their families. There were stories of soldiers sharing their last biscuit with a starving child, and other stories of bitter resentment when soldiers stripped a farm bare. The war did not just starve armies, it starved the communities around them. Hunger and poor nutrition had profound effects on morale. Soldiers marched with less energy reacted more slowly in battle, and were more susceptible to illness when their bodies lacked the nutrients to fight infection. A hungry army was an irritable army, and tempers often flared in camp when supplies failed to arrive. Diaries and letters home were full of complaints about rations, or the lack of them. One Confederate wrote bitterly in 1864, "We are fighting the Yankees on an empty stomach, and it is my opinion that we are hungrier than they are brave." Even in moments of plenty, food was a reminder of home and the life soldiers had left behind. Meals in camp were communal affairs, men gathering around fires to eat from tin plates and share whatever they had managed to scrounge. These moments could feel almost comforting, a small bubble of normalcy in an otherwise harsh existence. But the knowledge that tomorrow's rations might be smaller or absent entirely was never far from anyone's mind. Hunger was part of the fabric of a soldier's life, gnawing at him on the march, in the trenches, and even in his sleep. It was another reason why life in the ranks was so far from the heroic image painted in recruitment speeches and patriotic songs. When rations dwindled to almost nothing, soldiers grew resourceful and sometimes desperate. Foraging, officially sanctioned or not, became a survival skill. Men scoured the countryside for anything edible: wild berries, nuts, roots, and mushrooms. Fishing lines appeared in streams. Snares were set for rabbits or squirrels. And in more desperate situations, mules and horses that had died from exhaustion were butchered for meat. These were not pleasant meals, but hunger left little room for choice. Some regiments adopted creative cooking methods to stretch whatever provisions they had. In Union camps, soldiers sometimes baked a rough stew they called slumgullion, a concoction of meat scraps, vegetables, and hardtack boiled together until the hardtack softened into a mush. Confederate soldiers had their own improvisations like ash cakes, where cornmeal dough was wrapped in leaves and baked directly in campfire ashes. Though these solutions kept men alive, they offered little nutrition and did nothing to improve morale. Trading and bartering between soldiers was common, especially in prisoner of war camps or during periods of truce. A man with an extra spoonful of coffee might swap it for a piece of tobacco. Someone with a few precious spoonfuls of molasses could trade for extra bread. Coffee was so treasured by Union soldiers that it became a form of currency, and Confederates who captured Union supply wagons sometimes celebrated more over coffee beans than over ammunition. But scarcity also brought tension. When supplies ran dangerously low, discipline could fray. Stories survive of men raiding their own army's commissary wagons, or slipping away at night to liberate food from nearby farms. Officers were often caught in the middle, needing to maintain order, but understanding that a starving soldier was a soldier who couldn't march or fight. In the most extreme cases, hunger broke men's loyalty to their regiments entirely, leading to desertions. The psychological toll of constant hunger was immense. It wasn't just the ache in the stomach, it was the gnawing anxiety of never knowing when or if the next meal would come. Letters home from both Union and Confederate soldiers frequently pleaded for food packages. Families would send biscuits, cured meats, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables whenever possible. But these care packages often arrived spoiled after weeks in transit, or never arrived at all. The few times a soldier received such a gift in edible condition, it was shared generously, but also eaten quickly, because the war taught men not to save what could be enjoyed now. Even water, which should have been a soldier's simplest need, could be an ordeal. A canteen might be filled in the morning only to run dry halfway through the day's march, leaving a man to endure hours of thirst under the sun. In winter, water froze solid in canteens, forcing men to thaw it near the campfire before they could drink. And in stagnant southern swamps, the water was often a warm, murky liquid with bits of plant matter, and worse, floating in it. Men learned to strain it through a cloth before drinking, but that offered no protection from the invisible bacteria that could lay them low for weeks. By the war's later years, hunger became a shared misery across both armies. Union troops on extended campaigns, far from supply bases, sometimes suffered shortages as severe as those of the Confederates, and the Southern soldiers, already on meager rations from the war's beginning, were by 1864 often reduced to near starvation. It was a quiet killer, slower than bullets, but no less deadly, wearing down men's strength, resilience, and spirit until they could no longer endure the other hardships of soldiering. The way food was distributed and eaten in Civil War armies wasn't just about survival, it shaped the social fabric of camp life. Rations were typically issued to each company, then divided among smaller mess groups of 6 to 10 men. Within these messes, cooking became a shared responsibility. A man might be on rotation as the group's cook for the day, preparing meals over an open fire using a battered kettle or frying pan. Skill varied wildly. Some men could make a tolerable stew or bake cornbread in a Dutch oven, while others served scorched beans or half-raw bacon. Cooking itself could be a challenge. Wood had to be gathered or scavenged, and in rainy weather, finding anything dry enough to burn was nearly impossible. Soldiers often had to eat food half-cooked just to get something warm in their stomachs. In windy conditions, campfires smoked heavily, leaving food with a bitter taste. Some men embraced the smoker's seasoning, others cursed it with every bite. Food also became a focal point of humor and complaint. Jokes about hardtack were legion in Union camps. Soldiers nicknamed it tooth duller and sheet iron crackers. Some claimed it was so hard that it could stop a bullet. Confederate troops, when they encountered captured Union hardtack, sometimes mocked it, but often ate it gratefully, knowing it might be the best they would get for weeks. On the southern side, cornmeal rations inspired their own set of jokes and laments. Men said they'd eaten so much cornmeal that they were growing feathers. Despite the grumbling, Food was one of the few comforts soldiers could count on when it was available. Meals were moments of pause in otherwise grinding days. Around the campfire, men swapped stories, teased one another, sang songs, and sometimes shared precious extras sent from home. A jar of pickles, a wedge of cheese, or a small tin of preserved peaches. These shared meals were also times when soldiers opened up about their fears and homesickness, making food not just a physical necessity, but an emotional anchor. Yet food could also be a source of jealousy and resentment. Soldiers from wealthier backgrounds sometimes received more frequent and better quality care packages from home, while others went without. Officers generally ate better than enlisted men, and in hard times, the gap between their plates and the soldiers could breed quiet bitterness. In some Confederate units, accusations arose that officers hoarded food or diverted it to their favorites. Whether true or not, the perception deepened the sense of unfairness. By late in the war, food in both armies was a shadow of what it had been at the beginning. Union supply trains, though more reliable, still struggled during extended campaigns like Sherman's March to the Sea, where soldiers often lived off the land, stripping farms and towns bare. In the Confederacy, the situation grew dire. The Union blockade had choked off imports. Farmland had been ravaged by battles, and railroads that once moved supplies lay in ruins. By 1865, many Confederate soldiers were subsisting on handfuls of parched corn a day. Some were so weakened by hunger that they could barely stand in formation. It's telling that in soldiers' diaries and letters, food appears again and again, not just as a necessity, but as a measure of morale. A good meal, even if it was just a hot stew with fresh bread, could lift spirits for days. A stretch of bad rations or empty stomachs could break morale just as surely as a defeat on the battlefield. Hunger was a constant, shaping how soldiers remembered the war for the rest of their lives. Food in the Civil War wasn't just a matter of survival for soldiers. It was also a strategic tool, one that both sides used to weaken the other. The Union blockade of southern ports was perhaps the most far-reaching example. By cutting off the Confederacy from imported goods, including flour, salt, sugar, and coffee, the North gradually starved not just the Southern armies, but the civilian population that supported them. Railroads that might have moved food from farm-rich areas to the front lines were destroyed or captured, forcing Southern soldiers to fight on empty stomachs. Union armies also used scorched earth tactics during campaigns deep in Confederate territory. General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous march through Georgia in late 1864 left behind a swath of burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and destroyed mills. The idea was simple: deny the enemy the means to sustain itself. For Confederate soldiers who returned home after the war, Many found their family farms stripped bare, a wound that deepened the bitterness for decades. After, the Confederacy, though more limited in its reach, also targeted Union supply lines. Cavalry raids aimed at capturing or burning Northern supply wagons were common. A single successful raid could deprive a Union regiment of food for days. Sometimes, Confederate troops ate their fill from captured supplies before setting the rest ablaze. Inside besieged cities like Vicksburg in 1863, the food situation became truly desperate. Trapped by Union forces, residents and soldiers alike resorted to eating mules, dogs, and even rats. Accounts from inside the city describe mule meat stew and pea bread, made from ground peas mixed with cornmeal. Children cried from hunger, and soldiers were often too weak to hold their rifles steady. The surrender of Vicksburg was due in part to sheer starvation. Even in less extreme situations, food shortages could push soldiers to the edge. Desertion rates often spiked during long periods without adequate rations. In some regiments, men slipped away, not because they had lost their will to fight, but because they were determined to find food. Others stayed but grew bitter, convinced that their suffering was the result of incompetence or neglect by those in charge. The psychological effect of hunger was as damaging as the physical. It clouded judgment, slowed reaction times, and eroded discipline. A soldier might be willing to charge into enemy fire after a hearty breakfast, but after days on half rations he would trudge forward with his head down, his mind dulled by weakness. Hunger gnawed not just at the body, but at the will to fight, making it one of the quietest yet most effective enemies of the war. In the end, the story of food in the Civil War is a reminder that armies are not sustained by courage alone. Every battle, every march, every siege depended on whether men had the strength to stand and fight. And that strength began with what, if anything, they could find on their plates. For countless soldiers, the answer was not enough. For all the hardships soldiers faced, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the terrors of combat, one of the most constant and grinding miseries was exposure to the elements. The Civil War was fought in every season, from the sweltering humidity of southern summers to the bitter cold of northern winters, and soldiers were almost always outdoors. Shelter was minimal, often improvised, and rarely comfortable. The weather could be a companion one day and an enemy the next, capable of sapping morale, breaking health, and even killing outright. The official shelter, tents that barely sheltered. In the Union Army, the standard issue shelter for much of the war was the A tent. A simple canvas wedge supported by two upright poles and a horizontal ridge pole. While they offered some protection from sun and rain, they were heavy to carry and impractical on the move. Later in the war, Union troops began using the lighter shelter half system. Each soldier carried a piece of canvas that could be buttoned to another soldier's half to form a small tent. This cut down on weight but offered only the most basic coverage. Confederate soldiers often had no such luxury. The Southern supply system struggled to provide even uniforms, let alone standard tents. Many Confederates slept in makeshift shelters, lean-tos made from branches and blankets, dog tents, fashioned from whatever scraps of cloth they could find, or simply under the open sky. In bad weather, they dug shallow trenches and covered themselves with blankets or oilcloth, hoping the ground stayed dry beneath them. Canvas itself was not a perfect defense. In heavy rain, tents leaked. In strong wind, they could collapse. And in summer, the canvas trapped heat, turning the interior into a stifling oven. Soldiers often preferred sleeping outside, under the stars, on clear nights, rather than sweltering in a tent. Winter misery. Winter in camp was a test of endurance. Snow and ice made even simple tasks like cooking or fetching water miserable. The cold seeped into boots and clothing, numbing fingers until they could barely load a musket. Fires were essential for warmth, but gathering enough wood was a constant chore. When armies stayed in one place for the winter, known as winter quarters, soldiers sometimes built crude log huts with chimneys, filling the cracks with mud to block drafts. These structures could be surprisingly comfortable compared to tents, but they were temporary and only available in long-term encampments. Confederates fared worse in the cold due to shortages of blankets and warm clothing. Some soldiers wrapped themselves in tattered quilts from home. Others wore captured Union overcoats or patched their uniforms with scraps of whatever they could find. Shoes were a particular problem. By late war, many Confederate soldiers had to march barefoot in snow, their feet wrapped in rags or burlap. Frostbite was common, and some soldiers lost toes or entire feet to it. Summer heat and dust. If winter brought freezing misery, summer could be just as brutal in a different way. Heavy wool uniforms trapped heat, making marches under the blazing sun exhausting. Dust from dry roads coated faces, stuck to sweaty skin, and filled nostrils and throats until every breath tasted of grit. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were constant threats. Some soldiers stripped down to undershirts or went barefoot in camp, but this offered little relief during long marches or battle. Insects thrived in the heat. Mosquitoes swarmed in low-lying, swampy areas, spreading malaria. Flies congregated around latrines and garbage pits, spreading disease. Lice were perhaps the most persistent pests of all, infesting clothing, bedding, and hair. Soldiers picked them off when they could, but without hot water and clean clothing, lice always came back. The constant itching became part of daily life. The rain, a relentless enemy. Rain was the most universally hated form of weather in the Civil War. A light drizzle could turn a march into a slog, while a downpour could transform camps into muddy swamps. Canvas tents leaked, trenches filled with water, and campfires sputtered out. Wet clothing clung cold to the skin, and soaked boots rubbed blisters raw. Prolonged rain could make entire campaigns grind to a halt. Wagons became mired in mud, artillery pieces sank into the ground, and soldiers spent hours or even days shivering in place, waiting for the weather to clear. For those already weakened by hunger or illness, days of being soaked to the bone could tip the scales toward pneumonia or death. Sleeping on the ground. No matter the season, sleeping arrangements were almost always uncomfortable. Unless winter quarters had been built, a soldier's bed was usually the bare ground, perhaps softened with pine boughs or straw if available. In rain, the ground turned to mud beneath them. In cold weather, the frozen earth leached heat from their bodies all night long. Blankets were precious. Some soldiers had only one between two men and would sleep huddled together for warmth. Stories abound of soldiers waking in the morning to find their hair and blankets stiff with frost, or discovering that the shallow trench they dug to keep dry had instead filled with icy water during the night. Sleep itself was often broken, interrupted by bugle calls, the need to stand guard, or the discomfort of cramping muscles and shivering bodies. How weather wore down morale. While battles were dramatic, the weather's slow, constant pressure on soldiers was perhaps even more effective at wearing them down. A man could brace himself for a charge or an artillery barrage, but there was no way to fight rain, cold, or heat. Exposure gnawed at health, sapped energy, and dulled the will to endure. Letters home are filled with complaints about the weather, not as passing annoyances, but as daily, grinding miseries. Union soldier Elisha Hunt Rhodes summed it up in his diary. "We are fighting not only the enemy, but the weather. The rain soaks us, the sun bakes us, and the cold freezes us. I believe the weather will kill more of us than the bullets." For Civil War soldiers, shelter was never truly shelter, and the elements were never far away. Whether under canvas, in a crude hut, or lying under the open sky, a soldier slept and woke in the same hard truth. The war was not just against men, but against nature itself, and nature was utterly indifferent to their suffering. The public imagination often focuses on the Civil War's battles, dramatic, bloody, and decisive moments in history. But for the average soldier, those days were rare. Most of a soldier's time was spent not fighting, but waiting. Between marches and combat, there were long stretches of camp life that combined strict discipline with crushing boredom, a combination that could wear down even the most determined man. The unforgiving discipline, military discipline in the 1860s, was harsh by modern standards. Armies relied on strict obedience to maintain order among thousands of men drawn from every walk of life. Soldiers who disobeyed orders, showed up late to roll call, or neglected their equipment could be punished with extra guard duty, loss of rations, or public humiliation. For more serious offences, drunkenness on duty, theft, striking an officer, or desertion, punishments could be severe. These included being tied to a stake for hours, bucking and gagging, being forced to carry a heavy log or march back and forth under guard, or being made to wear signs announcing one's crime. In extreme cases, soldiers were whipped, branded, or even executed. Desertion, especially in the face of the enemy, was a capital offense, and both Union and Confederate armies carried out firing squad executions to set an example. This discipline was necessary for keeping order in an army that was often made up of volunteers rather than career soldiers, but it created constant tension. Men who had grown up free to make their own choices now found themselves living under the daily authority of officers, many of whom were no older than they were, or in some cases, far less competent. The monotony of camp life. When soldiers were not marching or fighting, they lived in camp, and camp life could be mind-numbingly dull. The day began with bugle calls and roll call, followed by drill practice, inspections, and maintenance of weapons and gear. These routines were necessary to keep the army ready, but they became monotonous. Drill in particular was a constant. Soldiers practiced forming lines, marching in step, and performing battlefield maneuvers over and over. In bad weather, this meant trudging through mud or snow. In good weather, it meant sweating under the sun in heavy wool uniforms. Many soldiers came to loathe drill, though officers insisted it saved lives in battle by making movements automatic under fire. When not drilling, soldiers filled time with small chores, mending clothing, cleaning rifles, cutting firewood, or cooking. For many, the hours between these tasks stretched endlessly. Without books, letters, or entertainment, boredom settled in like a heavy fog. Some men carved wood, played cards, or wrote in journals to pass the time. Others sang songs or told stories. But after weeks or months in one place, even these diversions lost their charm. Homesickness and isolation. Boredom had a cruel companion. Homesickness. Soldiers often went months without seeing their families. Letters from home were treasured, read and reread until the paper was worn soft, but mail delivery was slow and unreliable. The longer a soldier went without word from home, the more isolated he felt. Homesickness was more than sadness. It could sap a soldier's will to fight. Men who were otherwise healthy sometimes fell into deep melancholy, losing interest in eating, working, or keeping themselves clean. In the language of the time, they were said to have the blues or nostalgia, but we would recognize it today as depression. The temptations of idleness, boredom, and strict discipline sometimes led soldiers to seek relief in less wholesome ways. Gambling was common, despite being banned in most armies. Dice games, card games, and betting on foot races or boxing matches filled the hours. Alcohol, when available, was another escape. though drunkenness in camp could lead to harsh punishment. In occupied towns or near cities, soldiers might wander into saloons or brothels, leading to outbreaks of venereal disease that could sideline entire companies. Army doctors lamented these cases, but with little entertainment and constant stress, soldiers took risks they might have avoided in civilian life. The strain of constant readiness. Even during quiet periods, soldiers lived with the knowledge that orders could come at any moment, to march, to fight, to pack up camp. This constant readiness meant they never fully relaxed. A night could begin in peace and end with a bugle call to arms. In some camps, especially those near enemy lines, picket duty meant standing guard for hours at a time, watching for movement in the dark, knowing that an attack could come without warning. The combination of boredom and anxiety was mentally exhausting. Soldiers might spend weeks idle in camp, only to be thrown into a sudden, violent battle that shattered the monotony. Then, just as abruptly, they would return to waiting, with the added weight of grief for friends who had not returned. Coping mechanisms. To survive the mental strain, soldiers developed coping mechanisms. Humor was one of the most important. Jokes, songs, and playful nicknames for officers or camp conditions helped lighten the mood. Practical jokes, swapping someone's gear, playing tricks with tents, or staging mock drills, offered brief relief from routine. Religion was another refuge. Many soldiers attended camp prayer meetings or read from pocket Bibles. Revival movements swept through both armies at different times, with chaplains reporting large numbers of conversions. For some, faith provided hope. For others, it was simply a way to pass the long hours. But no matter how they coped, the truth remained. The long stretches between battles, with their combination of rigid discipline, crushing boredom, and constant uncertainty, were some of the hardest parts of the war. They left men restless, irritable, and worn down, and often eager for a fight, not because they loved war, but because at least battle broke the monotony. In the Civil War, soldiers faced two great fears in battle: death and injury. Death was final, but injury could bring weeks, months, or even a lifetime of pain and disability. For many men, the thought of being wounded was more terrifying than being killed outright, because it meant enduring the crude medical practices of the time. Battlefield medicine in the 1860s was primitive by modern standards. There were no antibiotics, limited understanding of infection, and little in the way of anesthesia. In many cases, survival was as much a matter of luck as of skillful care. The moment of injury. When a soldier was hit, his ordeal began instantly. A minié ball could tear through flesh, shatter bone, and leave ragged wounds that bled heavily. Shrapnel from artillery. Shells was even worse, sending jagged metal fragments deep into the body. Men hit in the head, chest, or stomach often died where they fell. but those struck in arms or legs might survive long enough to be carried from the field. Reaching the wounded during a battle was dangerous. Stretcher bearers had to dodge bullets, shells, and panicked horses to retrieve men lying in the open. Many wounded lay for hours between the lines, unable to move, their cries for water echoing across the field. Exposure added to their suffering. In summer, the sun baked wounds. In winter, cold numbed limbs and slowed bleeding, sometimes saving lives, but often leading to frostbite. Field hospitals. Once removed from the battlefield, a wounded soldier's first stop was usually a field hospital, often nothing more than a barn, church, or farmhouse converted for the purpose. The floors were crowded with men lying on blankets, straw, or bare boards. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and iodine. Flies buzzed over wounds and surgical tables. Surgeons worked quickly, moving from patient to patient, deciding who could be saved and who could not. Triage was brutal but necessary. Those with wounds deemed fatal were set aside to die, while the surgeon focused on those who had a chance of recovery. It was a grim calculus, made harder by the lack of resources. Surgery without modern comforts. The most feared word in a Civil War hospital was amputation. With shattered bones and torn tissue, amputation was often the only way to save a man's life. Without it, infection would set in and spread rapidly. Amputations were performed with frightening speed, sometimes in under 10 minutes, because the faster the operation, the greater the patient's chance of surviving the shock. Chloroform or ether was sometimes used as anesthesia, especially in Union hospitals, but supplies were limited and not every patient received it. Confederate surgeons often had to operate with little or no anesthesia, numbing the patient with alcohol if it was available. Even with anesthesia, the experience was traumatic. Without it, the screams of patients could be heard far beyond the hospital walls. Tools were simple: bone saws, scalpels, forceps. There was no sterilization as we know it. Instruments were wiped off and used again, sometimes still sticky with the blood of the previous patient. Bandages were washed and reused, often still damp when reapplied. This ignorance of germ theory meant infection was rampant. The shadow of infection. Even if a soldier survived surgery, his greatest danger was still ahead: infection. Wounds that appeared clean could turn red, swell, and begin to ooze pus within days. Hospital gangrene, a deadly, fast-spreading infection, was dreaded by surgeons. Without antibiotics, treatment was limited to cleaning wounds with harsh chemicals, applying poultices, or performing further amputations to remove infected tissue. Mortality rates were high, and the smell of rotting flesh was common in wards where gangrene had taken hold. Diseases like tetanus also struck the wounded. Known then as lockjaw, tetanus could kill within days, causing the jaw to seize and muscles to spasm violently. Many soldiers who survived their initial injury succumbed to infection within a week or two, often in terrible pain. Recovery and aftermath. Those who did survive faced a long recovery. In the absence of professional nursing care early in the war, many relied on comrades or volunteer nurses like Clara Barton or members of the U.S. Sanitary Commission to tend to them. The lucky might recover enough to return home. Others were sent to convalescent camps or discharged from service entirely. Amputees faced their own challenges. Wooden prosthetic limbs existed, but were crude and uncomfortable. Many men learned to live without them, relying on crutches or the assistance of family. The loss of a limb was more than physical. It carried social and economic consequences. A farmer who lost an arm might never work his land again. A labourer missing a leg might find himself unemployable. For some, this led to lifelong poverty. Scars, both physical and emotional, marked survivors for life. Many suffered chronic pain, limited mobility, or recurring infections from improperly healed wounds. Others experienced what we now recognize as psychological trauma, flashbacks, nightmares, and an aversion to loud noises. Why injury was feared above all? Because of these realities, soldiers often dreaded injury more than death. A quick death on the field was final. Injury meant months or years of pain, disability, and dependency. Letters from soldiers frequently expressed this fear, with some writing that they hoped, if hit, they would die instantly rather than linger in agony. The medical care of the Civil War was not wholly without progress. The conflict spurred improvements in organization, triage, and surgical techniques. But for the men living through it, these advances offered little comfort. The brutal truth was that to be wounded in the Civil War was to enter a race against time, infection, and the limits of 19th century medicine. Many did not survive it, and those who did carried the war with them in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The Civil War's deadliest enemy wasn't bullets, it was disease. For every soldier killed in combat, about 2 more died from illness. Cramped camps, poor sanitation, and contaminated water created perfect breeding grounds for sickness. Dysentery was the worst offender, claiming tens of thousands of lives through severe dehydration. Typhoid fever, pneumonia, measles, and malaria also tore through the ranks. With little immunity and primitive medical understanding, these diseases spread rapidly. Germ theory was barely known, so doctors often moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, unintentionally passing infections. Treatment was limited: opium for diarrhea, mercury compounds for fevers, quinine for malaria when available. Many remedies were ineffective or outright harmful. Hospitals for the sick were crowded, foul-smelling, and short on supplies. The toll was enormous. Entire regiments could be sidelined by an outbreak, and some campaigns stalled entirely due to sickness. Soldiers often feared disease more than battle, knowing it could drag on for days, rob them of strength, and kill them far from the glory of the front lines. In the end, disease claimed more lives than all the war's famous battles combined, leaving behind the grim truth that a sip of bad water could be deadlier than a bullet. Life as a Civil War soldier was a constant fight for survival, even away from the battlefield. Hunger, exposure, boredom, harsh discipline, injury, and disease combined to wear men down day after day. These hardships fed into each other. A man, weakened by hunger, could fall ill more easily. A sick soldier might falter on guard duty, and sleepless nights left men sluggish in battle. The mental toll was just as heavy. Soldiers lived with uncertainty, witnessed death up close, and carried those images for the rest of their lives. Many returned home with missing limbs, chronic pain, or invisible wounds we would now call trauma. Yet most stayed in the ranks, bound by loyalty to comrades, belief in their cause, or simply the impossibility of leaving. When the war ended, they came home changed forever. Their endurance left a legacy, a reminder that the Civil War was fought not only in famous battles, but in every long, cold night, every day of sickness, and every moment a soldier chose to keep going despite it all.